for key global trends in the 21st century. So our presenters this week come from different countries of the region as well as backgrounds. So we have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our facilitator, Dr. Constantin Arvanitopoulos. He is the chair of the Constantine G. Karmelis Chair, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I would also like to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Dimitris Triantafylou. He is the Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for International and European Studies at the Kadir Has University in Istanbul. He holds a BA in Political Science and History from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. His more recent applied and research interests include Greek-Turkish relations, Turkish foreign policy, Black Sea security and politics, and the EU foreign and neighborhood policies. So he will be presenting today on the systematic change and its challenges for the Eastern Mediterranean. So before turning the microphone over to our facilitator and our speaker, I wanted to let you know that I will be acting as the host of this event, and I will also guide the Q&A along with Dr. Arvanitopoulos' help. Which will follow the 30 to 45 minute presentation. The duration of our program is 1 hour and 30 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please just let us know in the Q&A chat, or you can raise your hand. And I'm also going to ask everyone to please turn off your microphones and to use either one of those that I just mentioned in order to communicate with us. And it's nice to have you all here today, and I hope that we have a productive presentation and discussion. Dr. Arvanitopoulos, you can have the floor now to introduce
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege to have with us today Professor Triantafylou, who is an old friend. We go back all the way to 1996 when we did our fact-finding mission for NATO for the first phase of the enlargement, going to Poland, Hungary, and the United Czechoslovakia at the time. Dimitris, as Maria mentioned, has done brilliant studies and in stellar institutions in the United States, and he has had a brilliant career. I'm not going to mention all the things he has accomplished because that would take us the rest of the day, but suffice to say that Dimitris knows many things and he knows them very well. He has been professor at Kadir Has for a number of years, and it's no secret that we are trying to lure him back to Greece, to my alma mater, to Pantheon University, and I hope that he will join our faculty sooner or later. But Dimitri is a great friend. He's a stellar academic, and we are looking forward to his presentation. Dimitri, it's great to have you. With no further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Touched, Constantine, by your introduction, and Maria as well. So now you've put a lot of, stress on me to deliver. I am, as you heard, I'm Dimitris Triantafylou. I'm a Greek, but I've been living and working in Istanbul for the last 10 years at Kadir Has University, which has been an interesting experience, interesting, challenging, not as challenging as many would expect, although Turkey is a country that's changing, and it has lost some of its luster, not in terms of working at the institution that I work at and working with my colleagues, but once you step out of that glass house of the university, the country is changing. But it's a country that's especially important for me and for my country as Greeks and for Europe as a whole. And it's always interesting. It's always producing news, even though I think the news are more on your side of the ocean over the last few days. Let me try to talk a little bit about, my topic is systemic change and its challenges for the Eastern Mediterranean. And I will focus more. I mean, I was thinking of how to do the presentation. I was thinking, should I include a PowerPoint or not? I will not include a PowerPoint presentation because mine is more general. I'm sure you had speakers the last 2 days, and you have speakers today and in the next few days that will include, given their topics, presentations and maps and everything. But I will start focusing more on the issue of systemic change, and then at the end I will get to the Eastern Mediterranean, as opposed to just going straight to the Eastern Mediterranean. Because I think this is important. We are undergoing systemic change, and how it affects us, it affects our countries, it affects regions of the world is something that we need to assess. It is not that I have the right answers, I just maybe have been thinking a little bit about it, and so let me sort of try to expound my thoughts on this. So, I mean, we live in times of great turmoil, and you might say this has always been the case. But these times are extraordinary, occurring every once in a while, given our inability to interpret correctly developments in the international arena. Maybe in the national arenas as well, but in the international arena. We live in a world in transition, right? One from multilateralism to a multipolar world where many of the poles, especially the great powers that have been at the core of the multilateral order and have benefited from it, especially the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, are themselves involved in the shaping of the emerging multipolar world, in conjunction with the emergence of a number of smaller regional or middle powers that seek a stake in the multipolar world as poles themselves. And it has been exacerbated by the fissures within the West, dating back to at least 2003, with the choices that the European allies had to make regarding whether to support the US invasion of Iraq at the time or not. And this trend has been compounded since with the emergence of transactionalism in international relations, in particular over the last 4 years of the Trump administration, which has sought to unravel some of the more recent successes of the multilateral order, such as the Iran deal of July 2015, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the Climate Paris Agreement of December 2015, as well as a number of trade deals that have been the bedrock of multilateralism, departing from the JCPOA and the Paris Agreement, attempting to rewrite NAFTA, withdrawing from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, undermining NATO from within, and many other acts in promotion of the America First agenda. And this has fundamentally weakened attempts to counter the rising challenge of China, which has both economic and geopolitical implications, the challenges posed by a declining Russia acting as a systemic disruptor, the growing cyber threat in all its manifestations, including its use to promote disinformation campaigns, and their impact on our societies, with the extended use of fake news, the social media and digital networks where fact-checking essentially is non-existent, and many, many more challenges. So all of this has led to the United States, for the United States to become more inward-looking, as I said, America first, with less focus on transatlantic relations or multilateralism, thereby undermining key institutions such as the United Nations, the North American Treaty Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. Institutions founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, right? So is multilateralism too tied to or connected to a particular historical context or to particular historical contexts? In particular, the evolving post-war order, which led to the creation and the rise of multilateral institutions, as I said, within the context of the nuclear age, bipolarity, superpower dynamics, and thereby showing the limits of structural realism, which was in many ways a theory for the Cold War, with its discussion on nuclear weapons, bipolarity, uncertainty, and superpower dynamics, seemed to be too tied to a specific, as I said, historical context. And therefore, you know, there has been an inability in a way to explain the disappearance of the bipolar order, which itself was a systemic change par excellence. Now, the second capstone of multilateralism is also its normative component, right? With the need to address, at the time, the barbarity, yet rationality of war, right? as well as the no rationality of the Nazi hatred in particular, and the concentration camps that were extermination machines. And I raise this because it's important. Values and norms, that's where they stem from. And in particular, then all of it in the United Nations Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in these 30 articles, I always suggest to all my students, you should read it over and over again, because those rights are what make us, are all about us. And the issue of non-rationality of war, I mean, sort of an aside, it's something, non-rationality of the Nazi crimes. It's something that Primo Levi, an Auschwitz survivor, has always tried to explain. He says war can be rationalized, but the acts committed by the Nazis in terms of the extermination, the attempt to exterminate all Jews and others cannot be rationalized. But anyway, all of this led, so the second capstone led to the drafting and adopting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which provides the normative framework for the liberal multilateral order, which has been strongly defended by Western liberal democracies, such as ours, right, or everyone's, because one can fundamentally seek political and legal recourse if any of the 30 rights enshrined in the declaration are violated without fear of retribution, thereby giving the rise to Western values and norms, right? The fundamentals of rule of law and the protection of human rights within the normative but very tangible space called the European Union, and which is the par excellence example of multilateralism. And before I go on, I should say, I mean, I will focus in particular, try to explain systemic change from the perspective of the EU, look a little bit, touched briefly from what it actually means for Turkey, and then also look at the Eastern Mediterranean and therefore what systemic change could actually mean for the US. Yet the US's divergence from multilateralism, coupled with its refocusing on Asia and China, has led European countries, both within the EU framework and outside it, as well as other states, the so-called third states of the EU, in that they are not member states of the European Union, to reconsider their prerogatives and priorities in the face of systemic change. Some have come to this realization or conclusion of the need to reconsider their strategic priorities in the wake of the evolution of alternatives to multilateralism and the institutions that espouse it, and their long-standing members of, or they still seek to join these institutions. So of which they are long-standing members or they still seek to join these institutions, while others are only more recently waking up to the fact. In other words, the systemic change underway, which I posit exists, or systemic disorder, some other analysts suggest, but I think it's change more than disorder, has undoubtedly given rise to what many consider today to be, because we always try to define our era, the geopolitical age, which is yet another iteration meant to define the flux that has marked the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. From the end of history and the emergence of the American century to a growing great power, cooperation, and competition. Notice the absence of the term superpower, right? We're in an evolution. Some have described it as a cold peace to the geopolitical age, where, for example, for the European Union, and I think this phrase very well encapsulates the geopolitical age, for the European Union, China is portrayed simultaneously as a partner, as a competitor, and as a rival. This is exactly what Josep Borrell, the High Representative, says, and many other EU officials, right? It's both a partner, a competitor, and a rival. Try to make sense of this. So we are actually living in this flux, or I always like to use the term liquid world, which has been, to paraphrase Zygmunt Bauman, a Polish sociologist who recently passed away, but I think very aptly describes the fact that nothing is really stable, everything is in flux. So for the EU, addressing China's increasing strength and assertiveness combined with its authoritarian ethos and represents its biggest challenge. But China's what we refers to, or is referred to as wolf warrior diplomacy, is part of a widened pattern of states from Russia to Turkey. There it's a lone wolf mentality, or coercive diplomacy, to Saudi Arabia and Iran, to the United Arab Emirates, and even to the EU's closest ally, the United States, which instrumentalize interdependence to achieve geopolitical goals. And as a result, the foundation on which the European Union is founded was built, a rules-based, multilateral, liberal system, and an ever more globalized economic system has grown increasingly wobbly. And so for the EU as a whole, this debate to the challenge of and how to address it is fairly recent, with all the talk about strategic autonomy and strategic sovereignty, as well as the need for a more geopolitical commission and by extension, a geopolitical union. This is all new stuff, new lingo that the EU is trying to cope with, and it's still at the discursive level. It's talking about it, not really doing much about it. And so to manage in this new world, the EU and its member states need to embark on a broad-based effort to ensure their strategic sovereignty. Strategic autonomy, which basically means strategic sovereignty. And of course, such a strategic sovereignty effort would seek to recalibrate the EU's efforts in a geopolitical world in order to strengthen its bargaining power and capacity to act in line with its interests and values. And so the goal there is not necessarily to walk away from the rules-based order, but to deter other players from undermining it, because that's where the challenge is. And aims to equip Europeans with the tools they need to bargain effectively within an interdependent system, right? To take countermeasures against spoilers of the international system and to make their own decisions in a more competitive geopolitical environment. And therefore, ensuring this geostrategic sovereignty does not imply transferring power or national sovereignty to Brussels, but rather reclaiming it from outside players, be it states, such as Turkey, and therefore Eastern Mediterranean is there, or in Russia. And Russia is not very far from the Eastern Mediterranean. Actually, there is more and more talk about the Black Sea Mediterranean condominium that has been emerging, which has replaced what we used to talk about, a Black Sea Caspian Sea condominium. Once you have Russian vessels going from their ports in the Black Sea all the way to its port in Syria. And so be it states or companies, right, such as Huawei and Amazon in that sense. And in fact, actually, some polling that has been conducted by the European Council on Foreign Relations consistently shows that large numbers of EU citizens want an EU that has this power, right? And that it can control its external borders, promote more resilient supply chains, and act decisively on climate change. So the whole issue about supply chains also means about rethinking the whole concept of globalization. So in terms of the EU's adaptation to this new world, there is some success already this year, some success, but we'll see in practice where it works, whether it's about, the eventually getting its act together to deal with the COVID-19 situation.
Good. I was afraid I didn't unlock the door.
Okay. Dealing with the COVID-19 situation, supplying the vaccine, finally negotiating a new pact in order to focus on the economies so that there is no economic downturn after the crisis, and so on. But so there is some success, but in addressing the end of this age of innocence, the EU finds itself in the midst of a strategic shift, right? As encapsulated in this global strategy of 2016, which downgrades, and I quote, transformation, and instead focused on protecting the EU's interest and ensuring stability and resilience. So in other words, the EU finds itself in the midst of reevaluating its policies and instruments, or the requisite mix of sticks and carrots, where the term power and its applications is starting to play a bigger and bigger role. And as Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, recently wrote, he's very active and has a blog, and he writes pretty long articles in his blog once a week. And one of them, a recent article, had to do with why is strategic autonomy salient more than ever. And his answer is because the world has changed, right? It is difficult to claim to be a political union, able to act as a global player, and as a geopolitical commission without being autonomous. But it's also interesting where he highlights three key factors influencing the need for more EU strategic autonomy. And let's take all three, and I'll raise a fourth one, but it's also important as we consider these, and as I try to link this to the Eastern Mediterranean, and you'll understand what I'm trying to get to. And so the first factor he talks about is the weight of Europe in the world is shrinking, right? 30 years ago, the EU represented a quarter of the world's wealth. It is foreseen that in 20 years, it will not represent more than 11% of the world GNP. Far behind China, which will represent double it, below the 14% for the United States, and at par with India. So the conclusion for the EU and for Borrell is straightforward, right? If we do not, he says, if the EU does not act now, it will become irrelevant, as many have argued. And strategic autonomy in this perspective is a process of political survival. And in such a context, the EU's traditional alliances remain essential. However, they will not be enough because power gaps are shrinking. The world will become more transactional, and transactionalism is a big, big term in today's world, and all powers, including Europe, will tend to be more transactional as well. So that's one. The second has to do with the transformation of economic interdependence, which Europeans have invested a great deal in, particularly in the defense of multilateralism. And today, the world is faced with a situation where the economic interdependence is becoming politically very conflictual. And what was traditionally called soft power has become an instrument of hard power. And this has been manifested clearly with the COVID-19 crisis, which revealed the fundamental asymmetrical nature of interdependence and the vulnerability of Europe. And one can remember, of course, what happened at the beginning in the last spring, where the crisis, where countries basically acting on their own, running out to try to get as many masks as they could, PPE and whatever, to cover the needs, not only of the medical professionals, but also of the population. And because the supply was basically in one country, China in particular. And so in this sense, issues such as science, technology, trade, data, investments are also becoming sources and instruments of force in international politics. And so one has to reflect this change, which means that the EU has to strengthen its instruments beyond security and defense. In particular, those competences and instruments of the Commission that it has at its disposal to defend its interests. The third issue, a key factor, is the shift towards Asia, is a world's focus towards Asia, particularly in US policy. And Borrell very correctly says it does not start with the Trump administration. The Obama administration initially decided to withdraw the last US tanks from Europe in 2013, but we had the Ukrainian crisis and they decided to bring it back on a rotational basis to an armored brigade. Still, the wider point stands, and also as the German defense minister said recently, and I quote, "Only if we take our own security seriously will America do the same." And fourth, so these were the three key factors. And then somewhere in his long article, he talks about, additionally, Europe is confronted on its periphery with a certain number of conflicts or tensions in the Sahel, in Libya, and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in these three cases, Europe must act even more and alone because these problems do not primarily concern the US. So it's interesting in the pecking order of things where our part of the world stands. And it's something to keep in mind. And not only that, because as I was rereading what I've written, also in terms of point 2, where he talks about issues such as science, technology, trade, data, investments, and so on, how little relevance so many of these things have for our part of the world, where we still think in terms of hard power, right? So this is systemic change and what is happening. And from an EU perspective, it's challenging. Let me briefly talk about Turkey before I move to the region. When it comes to Turkey, an EU candidate state, which increasingly does not act like one, its behavior could to a great extent be explained by the fact that it is also affected by systemic change, right? And its interpretation of the impact of systemic change on its national security. So perennially seeing itself as an outlier, both in geographic terms as well as in normative terms, it has sought and is seeking, within the purview of the self-help doctrine, to rationalize its power via more autonomous action and foreign policy. More and more convinced that the West, institutionally represented by NATO and the EU, does not provide the requisite guarantees to protect and defend Turkey's interests, and as such, does not seem to understand its concerns. And you have to factor in the fact that, and then I was lucky enough, I'm taking part in a research project with Turkish colleagues and Greek colleagues, and in September, I went with a Turkish colleague. We drove to Ankara for interviews with a number of Turkish diplomats and advisors to the Turkish president. So I've even had the privilege to visit the palace, the famous palace in Ankara, but also spent a couple of days in the foreign ministry. And one of the ambassadors that I was talking to, an old friend actually, but very much invested into projecting Turkish foreign policy and explaining it, says, when you have also projections of demographic growth to a country of at least 100 million within the next 20 years, as well as growth models showing that it will become, never mind the fact that right now it's going through an economic crisis, a top 10 global economy over the middle to long term, there are projections, right? How do you deal with systemic change? It has sought, therefore, to strengthen its claim or stake to being a significant pole, the poles I talked about at the beginning, in this geopolitical age. And this has been coupled with a strategic drift away from the West towards a strategic reorientation, a strategic drift away from the West towards strategic reorientation away from the West at some stage towards what exactly we do not know. As a pole, a standalone pole in alliance with others, but the drift is real. The reorientation, we're not there yet, right? If it fails, therefore, to receive the guarantees that it wants, in that it is one of the poles and thereby a key decision maker within the West or the international system, the way it has evolved. And this has an impact on the normative multilateral framework that defines the West and the EU in particular, which seeks to redefine itself without losing its soul. So, again, sort of a big picture, a very small sort of interpretation of how Turkey tries to envision itself. Because, and if you think about that, our part of the world, the Eastern Mediterranean, does have its share of poles. Whether we talk and focus a lot, as Greeks in particular, on Turkey, which is a pole in this multipolar world, so is Israel in its own way. So is Egypt in its own way. You have the great powers there. You have Russia anyway involved. You have the United States involved. Britain is there. It actually has a number of key assets in the Mediterranean, in particular the Eastern Mediterranean, which right now it's not been very active, but it is there. And therefore you can sort of see France is there. So you have a number of poles that converge in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, if we focus on the Eastern Mediterranean, one can see three main challenges for not only for this year, but maybe over the next 10 years, the next decade. The first is that the pace of change, of natural change, is accelerating. Because apart from the political dynamics and the hydrocarbons and so on, there are issues that have a direct impact on this Mediterranean, such as global warming in a dangerous region. Also, the COVID-19 impact in a region that lacks efficient health services. The global warming thing is, if one looks at reports from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it talks about the impact on the Mediterranean, one of the reports that came out a couple of years ago makes particular reference to Egypt and Alexandria. Alexandria is not too far from where I'm sitting in Istanbul or Athens or Larnaca or wherever else in the region. And because of climate change, if the temperature does rise above levels that it should not rise, it's estimated, and this is according to this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that about 8 million people in Egypt will be displaced. 4 in the Nile Delta, but 4 million in Alexandria itself. 8 million people will become internally displaced persons. So climate change is there, what we need to consider. Likewise, when it comes to COVID-19 impact, if one looks at a number of Oxfam reports in particular that have been written in 2020, the impact linked also to climate change means that there will be large waves. Oxfam estimates, it was an April 2020 report, they estimated 500 million people globally will be forced to migrate, out of which a large chunk would come from Africa. And you know, in Africa, people tend to migrate either down south to South Africa or up north, and from the north across the Mediterranean. So there will be challenges there. So that's what I'm saying. The pace of natural change is accelerating. The demographics in the region, the demography of the region is still very dynamic. The proportion of youth is still very high, and this implies massive migration shifts linked to persisting underdevelopment, which the EU is not ready to deal with. Secondly, social and political instability in the region continues at a time where there are weaker links between the EU and the region's countries. There are various protests going on across the region. Borders are being challenged, and there's also a crisis of trust, and I'll get back to this. Nationalism is on the rise, not only in Turkey, but in Arab states as well. Conservatism prevails, where you see attempts to restore the ancien regime or the old regimes. This is a case in Egypt. Islamism is a factor as well. And it's two levels here. Islamism is Muslim states competing with each other, but also attempts to co-opt the Ummah, right? UMMAH, the multi-Muslim supranational community, which transcends nations. Turkey is trying to do that, for example, right? And linked to this is also the promotion of a clash of civilization discourse, which has an impact. So as a result, the progressive camp in countries of the region is being marginalized. And as a result, the impact or effect of Europe is being reduced, right? With its norms and values and you know, of liberalism, market economy, human rights, and so on. And therefore, the question there is, who does the EU have to work with whom to work with? Third is that wars and conflicts are ongoing in the region. A colleague of mine, Dorothee Schmidt, who runs a Turkey program at IFRI in Paris, talks about creative wars. She used the term creative wars, the emergence of new conflicts since the Arab Spring. And even though one could say that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could be resolved, we have trouble brewing elsewhere, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria. And as a result, the Mediterranean has become an experiment with proxy wars being fought with the use of mercenaries, new technologies being used, such as drones, as well linked to the ongoing arms race and becoming a factor in it. Also, the seas are becoming a battlefield again, right? The sea itself is becoming a battlefield. One should not underestimate the fact that the return of naval wars is possible. Another friend and colleague, Amin Tarzi, who is at Marine Corps University, he's a director of Middle East Studies there, he talks about maritime juggernauts. And when he looks at the seas across the world, he considers the Mediterranean to be worse than the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulfs. And he uses a term that terrorism at sea is underway. It's not piracy at sea. It's not about a group of pirates for their own sets of reasons that board ships and ask for ransom. They board tankers and ask for ransom. But terrorism at sea, where the objective is to push a political agenda. This is linked to coercive diplomacies and so on. And therefore, there's a potential of a time bomb in the Eastern Mediterranean that we should keep this in mind. And thus, creative wars have emerged where the willingness to fight seems to be real, while the EU, trying to deal with systemic change, is not ready for intervention. Only France is able and willing, but it has its differences with Germany over this issue. And this makes the EU more vulnerable because of geographic proximity than, say, the US. But it's also interesting how, in this sense, the emergence of Turkey as a pole, as a pivotal state in the region, and also as well between Europe and the US. How do you deal with this? You have contested territories. I talked about maritime juggernauts and terrorism at sea. And there's also an enhanced sense of lack of trust between governments, with international organizations, with alliances. And therefore, the military option becomes the solution. And in all of this, now I get to hydrocarbons, which many would posit that this is a key factor driving developments in this Mediterranean. I think the hydrocarbons are important, but the tensions are not primarily about hydrocarbons. It's about addressing systemic change within a region where there are historical rivalries, and not only, right? In terms of hydrocarbons, we know the region compensates. You're going to have a lecture about it, I think, tomorrow. 2 billion barrels of oil, 4 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, and so on. We have the formation of the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, where 7 countries, littoral states of the region, have gone together, and other countries are also trying to become observers to this. Overlapping exclusive economic zone claims. So we have to put that into perspective. For the US, Costantino, let me know how much time I have left. Maybe. Okay. For the US, the region has a global dimension, right? Because the biggest issue is Russia, which seems to be seeking to play the role of a disruptor. And I told you about this emerging, evident link between the Black Sea region and the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean to Syria, also as well to Libya. And China, which does not necessarily try to wreak havoc like Russia, but it's more of a long-term issue, not an immediate threat, but a potential one. Priorities are, as I said, China. Thank you. Maria sent me a message with how much time I have. Okay. China, Russia, China, the Iran deal, whether it can be saved or not, we shall see. It's one of the priorities of the incoming Biden administration. But, the Biden administration is inheriting a world that did not stop on the last day of the Obama administration. It's inheriting a world that stops at the last day of the Trump administration. Never mind what its intentions are. The Biden administration is not going to pull out its embassy from Jerusalem to go back to Tel Aviv. It's a given. We know what has happened in terms of, Iran over the last few years since the US pulled out of the deal, right? Where the investment has been more on missiles as opposed less on the nuclear, but the missiles and the ability to threaten with intermediate missiles and so on has become greater, threaten neighbors. So we shall see whether it's feasible, but it's a priority. Yes, how do you ensure that maybe the East Med Gas Forum is enhanced? I said we have 7 countries as part of it right now: Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, Israel, Italy, Jordan, and Palestine. The United Arab Emirates has become an observer. There seems to be the intention of other countries, maybe Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, that want to link into this. Ideally, how do you make this a forum where maybe even Turkey should have a role? But this would, and I think even the Greek Prime Minister recently said that, but on the assumption that Turkey does play by the rules. But how do you create that condominium, this forum, to be successful? France, we also are aware, is the only EU country doing something. And I told you before, the UK is not currently present, although it has the biggest assets in the Mediterranean, from its bases in Cyprus to Gibraltar and so on. Even Qatar wants to have its flag there. And I mentioned before, the Emirates or Saudi Arabia. These are not countries that need gas. Qatar has the world's 2nd largest gas reserves. They just want to have their flag there. It's interesting how the systemic changes, developing dynamics, or one would not expected a few years ago, where you have the countries of the Gulf, all of them moving, either challenging or positioning themselves against each other, or trying to become players in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the issue is, what does one do other than the need to have to talk more with each other? In all of this, and I'll end with this because maybe we can have a discussion, there's a need for a strategic outlook. It applies to the EU, it applies to most countries of the region, at a time where right now only maybe Turkey and Israel seem to have one. And I think part of the Turkish conundrum is the fact that Ankara realized before other countries that the world is changing fundamentally. And it needs to exploit this. And exploit, I do not mean it pejoratively, I mean in quotation marks. The situation, thinking about enhancing and promoting its own national interests and defending its own national interests. Because the doctrine of self-help applies to everybody when it comes down to things. But these are the only two countries that seem to have a strategic outlook, while others are still thinking about it. Another trend over time is that the growing obsolescence, and that's why I also think the dynamics are not about energy, of fossil fuel economy in the region. At some stage it will become, because we also have other trends developing with other sorts of forms of energy. An obsession with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Bahrain, and we don't know how this will evolve. Of course, this evolving Black Sea Mediterranean, I call it a condominium. There's a link between the regions. I just came up with the term condominium. It could be something else, but there are linkages now between these regions. And then it makes you think, and then, if I put on my hat as a Greek analyst as opposed to an IR analyst, what does all of this mean for a country like Greece, which, in the grand scheme of things is a small country? And maybe within the EU, it's a mid-sized country, right? So what are options for small EU member states? And in this part of the world, you have Greece and you have Cyprus, even smaller. That, of course, would prefer the shell of the EU's multilateralism and trying to enhance it, because it means having more of an impact in decision-making in what is happening in the Eastern Med, which, as I have tried to show, is not necessarily a priority in the grand scheme of things, even for the EU, much less for the US, right? Then we prefer that to the transactionalism, which is driven by larger powers and their prerogatives. Because the transactionalism forces a country like Greece, correctly, right, to seek to enhance its relationship with the US or with France or the Emirates. But think about the conundrum here. France, Greece, United States, Turkey. These are all NATO member states operating outside the NATO framework, trying to enhance and advance their interests in this part of the world. Because the NATO framework does not allow for this. And for the Europeans, the EU framework does not allow for it either, right? And so the same thing applies to Cyprus to a much greater degree. And coupled in with this is whether the restoration of US leadership, in particular in Europe, as I think has been a stated goal of the incoming Biden administration, is possible. Because we already see divisions in Europe, with Germany being more enthusiastic, while France is more nuanced, as the French president is also positioning himself, and probably will do so even more should he win the presidential election in his country next spring. For a leadership, not necessarily EU-driven or Europe-driven, but France-driven, to account for systemic change, which would mean a greater French role in the Eastern Mediterranean, as it is already there. I think I was just reading that its big aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle, is on its way to the Eastern Mediterranean for a rotational tour of duty. But how do you deal with this? So I'll stop here. I don't know whether I made sense or confused you more, but the more I think about these things, it is confusing, but there are no real answers. But I think if we go from an outside-in perspective, we realize again that the Eastern Mediterranean, that there's so much interest to so many of us, is a small part, is not an insignificant part of the equation of the systemic change. And one has to, see it also from that perspective. So, Maria.
So thank you so much for that presentation. You made some very wonderful remarks. So we do have a couple of questions.
Let me, before we get into the questions, Maria, if I may, let me thank Dimitri for this tour d'horizon and use the privilege of the chair to ask him the first question, and then you can go on and facilitate the rest of the questions. Dimitri, you made a very good point, I think, that and I couldn't but agree more with you that Turkey has very skillfully adapted to the systemic changes that we see happening. And I think in this polycentric international system that is taking shape, there is no pressing issue. I mean, there is no pressure for a regional power such as Turkey to belong to one particular bloc, or to the West for that matter. And so we have observed for the last years, for the last couple of years even more, a skillful attempt on the part of Turkey to do this cherry picking, so to speak, from all the great powers of the international system. But my question is that I think that Turkey, the ambitions of Turkey exceed the ambitions of a regional power, in the sense that I think that Turkey wants to become one of the major stakeholders of the new international system. It's not sufficient for Turkey's ambitions to remain a regional power, skillfully manipulating the structure and the actors of the new polycentric international system. It seems that the ambitions exceed the status of a regional power, and I think reach the level of becoming a major systemic power. And if so, if this assessment is correct, what do you think is the impact for the regional balance of power and events in the East Med?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's why I said, Turkey is in the midst of strategic drift to a strategic reorientation, but we do not know to what exactly. But it's more into developing a new model for itself, which is very much in line, I guess, with what you are saying, with much more global ambitions. I mean, I think in one of his speeches a few days ago, Erdogan talked about, why shouldn't Turkey become a nuclear power? Others have, this is also part of the discourse, right? So this implies all these things. There are problems, though, to get there. I mean, even though the projection is that Turkey will become a great economic power over time, the population is not going to stop anytime soon. It's not going to, at some stage it will taper off, but, in terms of the dynamics, it will be a very powerful country with a strong industrial base. But there are some limits to its ambition that have to do with the internal dynamics. And the internal dynamics have to do with Turkey, as opposed to, say, Egypt or other big powers. It cannot undo, never mind what its government wants right now, cannot undo this relationship with the West that it wants to undo overnight. This has had an impact on the way its administration functions, on the way a large segment of its population thinks, a lot of its elites, secular elites, and not only, right? It has adopted a number of values that are Western, starting with, when the Republic was declared in 1923, and, what Ataturk tried to do, we belong to the West because this is the only way for us to survive. This has affected the way its military functions. Overnight, I mean, its supply chain, everything comes from the West. You cannot overnight replace all of that in your strategic thinking. And so there's a real debate there, and you can see this dilemma. You can see this dilemma and how society, or a large segment of society, is resisting. And I do not know yet, we do not know how, you can see that recently with what's happening with Boğaziçi University protests, right? Bosphorus, the university, Istanbul University, one of the elite universities of Turkey, which obviously has a much more, elitist, but not only Western orientation, where, up to now, it was still one of these places and spaces where you could protest within certain limits and be allowed to express yourself. And so there's that clash there, and the resistance at times where it's more and more difficult to resist. I mean, this is a topic when I'm called upon by the Greek press to talk. And today I could talk about, exploratory talks, but when they called me the other day to talk about Boğaziçi, I said, I'm not going to talk about it. I understand my limits also. It's one of these things that I will not, I'd rather not, right? But nevertheless, it's interesting to see the students out there and many of the professors trying to make a case, knowing that there would be consequences. Right. So this is the interesting thing about Turkey. Obviously, the government has its ambitions, and of course, they transcend this government. It is true also, right? I mean, after all, there's some rationality in its thinking as well. And we might find its manner coarse and challenging and, outside the realms of international law, but there's a logic to it. So the global ambitions are there. I do not know if there's consensus for these yet. Okay. Because, it is an overreach, right? I mean, even conceptual and material and so on, that you are something more than what you are right now. And there's a great unknown out there. And I think, that's the cherry picking, as you said, is correct. But we shall see. We shall see whether it's going to be able to do this, or it will, by being outside the West, but yet close to the West, prefer that option. So it's too early, I think, to address this question.
Good points. Maria, the floor is yours to facilitate the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Arvanitopoulos. So the first question in the Q&A box says, hello, Dr. Triantafylou. Analyzing the rationality of war as a means of safeguarding sovereignty, identity, and security is commonsensical. Could informational and economic war to control the resources in Eastern Mediterranean be analyzed from this point of view when we're speaking about the aggressive role of the Turkish state in normalizing and perpetuating military, diplomatic, and religious violence? There's another part of the question. It says, how is it possible to pretend the leadership of the Ummah when promoting sectarian segmentation? I don't know if you want me to hold off and repeat that.
Well, whatever. I mean, I could just reply. I mean, yes. I mean, I talked about the rationality of war in the context of the post-war environment and the attempt to create a multilateral world order. But I also when I talked about what Borrell suggests as priorities, that instruments of soft power, and therefore, when in your question, when the question that talks about informational and economic power, which one would assume all these are issues of soft power, also become instruments of hard power, that these are instruments that are used today as well. Yes. Now, the aggressive role of the Turkish state in normalizing and perpetuating military, diplomatic, and religious violence. I mean, okay, this is language I try to, when I analyze, I try not to see it that way. Is it aggressive? Yes. But I think it's part of a rationalization. Right? It's part of a rationalization of a way to augment its power, augment its negotiating power in particular, so that it has a bigger seat at the table, by using different tools at its disposal. And part of those is the informational war. Yes, I mean, what do you mean by informational war? Turkey is very, very active in the social media realm, very, very well prepared, where any news that come out, whether it's the Anatolian news agency, Anadolu agency, or TRT World, right? Turkey also has its own global channel, right? English news channel, 24 news channel, is out there projecting immediately the later utterance of the president or the foreign minister or certain Turkish positions in terms, in order to influence us and our news feeds. Yes, it's doing that. So, yeah. I mean, this is where the world is evolving, and Turkey has many means at its disposal to use these instruments. How is it possible to pretend? Well, it's an attempt. It's an attempt. When promoting sectarian segmentation, if you can get away, if you control the news, you can get away with many things as well, right? I mean, Turkey, like every country, does things that do not make sense at times. It cannot be rationalized. Turkey was leading the fight against the Uyghurs in the Uyghurs and their concentration, or they're being rounded up in concentration camps in China, and now it has as it's doing that drift towards away from the West. It also has launched I think it's called an Asia New strategy, which is its China and Asia strategy. And it prefers to upgrade relations with Beijing and not talk about what's happening to the Uyghurs. Okay. uh, I do not see that Turkey is doing something different. I mean, other than being more coercive in its approach than other countries are. Okay. Yes.
So we do have another question by Nikolasi Bakirziz. I'm sorry if I totally mispronounced that. The person thanks you and asks about your opinion about the Cyprus issue under the current circumstances with Tatar's win and Turkey's aggression and actions in the region. Do you think that a two-state solution is the only solution, or that there are still hope for another kind of agreement? And can the U.S. under the new administration play a more active role?
Yeah, I mean, on Cyprus, there's a lot of movement there. There's a lot of movement even right now as we speak. We have to wait and see. I mean, the Turkish position itself is problematic. It's problematic also for the Turks. I mean, there are many issues happening in Cyprus right now. We should also be aware of these. There are divisions among the Turkish Cypriots anyway, in the Turkish Cypriot community, as to what position the North should hold, right, on this. The Turkish Cypriots are divided. This was the most divisive presidential election, right, between Akinci and Tatar that they've had in recent history. And there are divisions there. A two-state solution, I don't know. I mean, you know, some people are saying it's a negotiating ploy because a two-state solution means that it loses any leverage on the EU. If you have a confederation or you have a federation, Turkey will always have a way to have some more leverage on the EU, even though this is a solution that many would want. By promoting a two-state solution, you're out of the EU game. So I think it's more of a negotiating ploy. But on Cyprus, I think what we should also look at the Republic side. And in the Republic side, there's a real lack of trust right now with institutions. I mean, there is a big scandal going on. The whole political system is being affected. And I think if the Republic of Cyprus does not get its act together about what it wants, and because this being the priority issue in Cyprus, deflecting attention from the internal political dynamics. I mean, and if you follow up with the passports and everything, and you've had Cypriot citizens coming out to protest about the political system, where many parties are involved. It's not just the governing party. And so, you know, to sidestep or attention away from the scandal, you start dealing or addressing the resolution of the Cyprus issue. I think it's much more nuanced in Cyprus right now, even though there is going to be a push. We know that there is an attempt to restart talks. The Secretary General's report just came out on the extension of the UNICEF mission. And so we shall see. Okay, I think this is the best I could do in answering that question.
Perfect, thank you. So we do have another question. It's a little bit lengthy, so just bear with me. Let me know if you need me to repeat any parts of it. So this one is by Konstantinos Venakis. Recently in the Greek public sphere, there have been a prolonged discussion about old Greek-Turkish challenges, although it has been enhanced with the new dilemmas of our times. In this context, EU stance on the recent Greek-Turkish crisis have been described by a number of scholars, the government and the prime minister, as an oceanographic vessel that is difficult to maneuver, but when it has changed its course, then it gets steady. How do you assess this rhetoric? Is it valid in your own opinion? And can the Greek public and policymakers rely, and by extension, wait on the EU to change its course?
Yes, I mean, the Greek public and policymakers have no choice. As I was trying to say, as a small state, and given the nature of the EU, Greece can influence or try to influence the EU position on this. That it's difficult for it to change course, absolutely. It's difficult because it's a complicated institution where you not only have to deal with 27 member states that have diverging interests, from lack of interest, which is given as well if you geographically you are away from this part of the world or have no connection to Turkey, to other economic and social interests, to institutions that are diverging. I mean, you have a player like the European Parliament, which is becoming more and more prominent and a spoiler in the whole process. But there's also a big debate going on right now, because there's a big debate going out right now regarding whether this is the the year of the EU in Turkey-EU relations, or the year of Turkey in EU-Turkey relations. And many analysts, especially when one reads the Greek press, many analysts seem to suggest that it is, because there's an acceptance on the part of the EU that transactionalism, as I was trying to explain, is part of the game. And therefore, by dealing with the positive agenda, because Turkey is pressured at the particular moment, one could actually normalize relations, more or less. On the other hand, others are saying no, we should not, even the EU is not able to do this. Some friends and scholars suggest even, the attempt of Greece to restart exploratory talks, and Turkey's attempt as well with Greece, and the attempt by Greece to try to get EU support for what the agenda of these exploratory talks will be is the wrong attempt. I just written an article recently on Saturday where I suggested that maybe my assessment, I would, ideal scenario would be for Turkey to become a member of the European Union, because it means that, and this is still the Greek position, I think, and officially, institutionally, this is still the EU position, that it actually means that it binds EU to norms and values and the way it should operate, good neighborly relations and so on. But in the absence of this, we cannot just go and wait for a report, because now everyone is now waiting for the report of the High Representative that will be discussed in the next European Council about, both about what sanctions will be in play if Turkey backtracks from some of its agreements, as well as a positive agenda. I posit that maybe what the EU needs, and this is a way for Greece to also influence the process, would be to promote, to come out with a committee of wise men, wise persons committee, that would be mandated to operate in particular this year, which is a good year because Germany is going through a transition. In September, you're going to have a new chancellor. So no one in Germany wants to take decisions right now. But you give a mandate to a committee of wise persons to come up with options about what strategy 2.0 of the EU towards Turkey would be. And options, and these would be then adopted by the European Council. And then the EU would actually have dealing also with its aspect of strategic autonomy, which right now is just talk, and no serious attempt are made. I mean, there's an awareness that the world is changing, that the EU needs to address these changes, but there is nothing really being done about it. And I feel that if the EU does not have a clear strategy, which might have accession as one of the options, it should always be on the table, it cannot move forward. And I'll tell you a last thing, because I've been involved in a number of closed meetings on these issues, and one of them recently was where the rapporteur for the European Parliament on Turkey, Ignacio Sanchez Amor, was talking, and this was after the recent vote in the European Parliament condemning Turkey for for a number of violations of agreements it has with the EU. He says, and of course, this has not found national capitals very happy, some national capitals. But he says, as a European parliamentarian, institutionally, the European Parliament can only see Turkey within the guise of the accession process. This is the only institutional arrangement that exists. While EU member states are more transactional in their nature. If you look at the conclusions of European Council meetings, there is a reference to that, but it's also about positive agenda. Rule of law is not mentioned in the last council meetings, and so on. So this shows a discrepancy on the part of the EU. But so the EU has to show a willingness that it's ready to come up with a new strategy to be able to deal with Turkey, which also addresses its need for what strategic autonomy is. I mean, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but all these issues are complicating it. Therefore, steering the EU is difficult. But it's still the only sort of vessel I think that makes sense for the majority small and very small countries that make up the European Union. And that should say why it's an important vessel for Greece and Cyprus with which to try to influence from within. Yes.
Okay, awesome. I actually have another question for you by Margaret Clay, and it actually works with what you were just talking about. So she asked, you talked about the declining of the EU and how they must maintain their current relationships, but also create new ones. Would the EU finally consider integrating Turkey into the European Union?
Yeah. You cannot discount that. You have to leave it on the table. And if I link this a little bit to my remarks to Professor Vantopoulos' question, there is a segment of the population in Turkey. Actually, public opinion polls are very interesting. And I think a new one just came out. I'm waiting for the English version to come out later today, conducted by my colleagues at my university, that shows there's a question that's asked every year in this poll. So it's a qualitative poll with a large sample about the percentage of the Turkish population that would like for Turkey to be a member of the European Union. It's about 50% and above, steady. Now, if you ask them the question, will Turkey become, the numbers decline. But the point is, the fact is that society for decades, never mind the fact that Turkey acts as an outlier, and I think Turkish citizens think they're outliers anyway, with one foot in the EU and the West and one foot out, they have been influenced for this decades-long, almost a century-long attempt to belong to the West, and also the relationship with the European Union. So you cannot discount that. You have to leave it on the table, because it also provides for the normative elements of what it is that the EU wants, and which it actually does want a Turkey that follows up on rule of law and human rights and so on and so forth. But it cannot just be the only option. So one also needs to put other issues on the table, other positions on the table. Because again, the accession process in itself, if you take out Turkey and you look at it, has changed significantly from when it started. I mean, the last two countries that started accession negotiations last year were North Macedonia and Albania. And that in itself is under a lot of pain and stress, where the rules of the game regarding their accession process was changed because France and other countries were not happy with the process the way it was. They wanted more accountability, right? We've moved beyond Copenhagen criteria. We've moved beyond absorption capacity to other things. So the accession process, again, was also something that started at a particular moment in time, and it gained momentum, in particular in the post-war era, in the post-Cold War era, where you have most countries join the European Union. So you cannot discount it, but it cannot be the only, I think, part of the relationship, because otherwise it would mean that Turkey as a third state, a third country, would always use that. Cherry picking where it can, and create, and therefore you would have a lot of states and officials from different countries and EU institutions saying, well, but they still intend to join us. But then we have to turn a blind eye on other issues. So one needs to recalibrate policy and be honest about it. The accession process when it comes to Turkey has actually fundamentally changed from when it started very early in the process. I mean, if we think that this process started in 1999, 2002, 2004, the whole methodology changed. And it was about the same time when I think it was Merkel or people in her party saying that we need a strategic partnership with Turkey. It was at a time when it was Sarkozy as the candidate for the presidency was talking about strategic partnership. Even Greece changed its approach a little bit when it came to Turkey. With the New Democracy government in 2004, thinking that it should not be tied into some of the things in Helsinki. But anyway, so since then the approach has changed, and of course Erdogan also changed his position regarding whether he wants to join the EU or not. So it cannot be the only issue on the table, and I think the EU has to figure it out and be bold and brave about it. Konstantinos, do you agree with me on these things, or? Let's hear your perspective too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the poll that you mentioned is indicative of the prospects, in the sense that it's still on the table, but it's to a certain extent it has been derailed for many reasons that we can go on and examine and talk about. But it should still be on the table, and I think that. and the EU is trying to recalibrate its relationship with Turkey. We've seen over the last year movement to that direction, not only with the agreement that has to do with the migration agreement, but also with the proposal that has been tabled about the new customs union agreement, so to speak. So there is movement. I think that we're not anywhere close where we used to be with respect to Turkey's accession for a number of reasons. But I think you're absolutely right. This is still on the table.
Yeah. It's something to see. I also wanted to. I just saw that in the chat. Margaret had a question about what did I mean by the end to the age of innocence. And the age of innocence means that the world operates on the principles, values, and norms of what the West considered to be. That's what the EU thought. The EU, thought it still has transformative power, which a lot of its neighbors want and aspired to become part of it. It's for the same reason that the EU in 2012 received the Nobel Prize for Literature, because it's an aberration, right? It's an aberration, 60 plus years of peace in Europe in particular, in the grand scheme of things, right? When we look at history. And so the assumption was that it can provide, whether a country joins or not, a neighbor joins or not, whether one is qualified to join or not based on geography, that it was a model to which the world would start adopting. And I think the systemic change in place and the emergence of different poles suggests that that's gone. And so how do you deal with it? Are you still a relevant power? The EU, that can be a global power, because it is a global power in so many aspects, and a relevant power at a time when its power to attract is not what it used to be. And therefore it has to recalibrate its instruments and its tools.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I actually have a question. So you mentioned a little bit about Turkey and the Arab world, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the relationship between Turkey and the Arab world going forward. In particular, you mentioned about migration and climate change and how that is going to cause mass displacement in North Africa and the Middle East. I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, we have the conjunction of that's why I said one is, in particular climate change, which are natural causes for enhanced migration, and the fact that you have many wars and conflicts in the neighborhood, and plus the demographics, and all these things having an impact on increased migration. We also know that the history of mankind is a history of migration, right? If all of us were to do a DNA test right now, we'd be surprised what's in us, right? And where we come from. I know there's a nice video circulating somewhere on YouTube about people being surprised, being given a DNA test, and then they're being asked, what are you? Well, I'm 100% German, and my roots are this. And then the person discovers that he's also part black this, and that's migration, right? But the impact would be, the issue would be that if it's not managed migration, and migration is, it has two aspects to it too. One is managing it so that people that do manage, because they go through the different criteria and tests that are needed to emigrate and migrate to a country based on whatever reasons, they can, it does not have a negative impact on the societies of the countries it's migrating, if it's not managed. And so right now we are talking about trying to manage it and deter mass migration, because European societies are not ready to take on more migrants, even though the numbers indicate, right, if you look over the medium to long term in terms of the needs for the economy and so on, you would need, and the negative demographics in Europe as opposed to the positive demographics still in North Africa and the Middle East, you would need a number of migrants to be incorporated in the economy. But because of the continued conflicts and choke points, whether it's the Aegean or it's Central Mediterranean via Libya, or it's in the Western Mediterranean, where Spain periodically faces an influx of migrants. Right now, there's again a big conflict with Morocco and attempts at Salem. I can't remember what the two cities are in North Africa that belong to Spain, where there's a wall actually there, trying to deter further migrants. And so we are focused on that, instead of focusing on how to integrate them in our societies, right? And it also is very telling that governments do not have the wherewithal, the tools right now to be able to cope with these challenges at the same time. Integration per se, and therefore educating one society, the society is changing, and containing migrants, refugees, and others on the basis of maintaining certain rules in terms of access. And the challenge is when this is used as a weapon, right? So when the refugee issue becomes a part of one's coercive diplomacy, it creates further tensions. It feeds into the clash of civilization discourse, because, oh, who are you keeping out? You're keeping out the Muslims and others that, should be able to come because they're being persecuted back home. It perpetuates, right, all the negatives about the other, that we never understand the other, but we all have, we see the other, into quotation marks, in negative terms. And I think these are the implications. It's a combination of man-made conflicts, that's what wars and civil wars are, and the inability to stop them. Natural causes, natural reasons, climate change is creating that. And as I said, the demographics, where again, this is where the EU policy has been for a long time when it comes to the countries of North Africa and the Middle East, in terms of providing technical and financial assistance so that the economies of these countries are able to be moved from the underdevelopment stage to the developed stage, and therefore sustain their younger populations, but they're not able to do so, right? So, and I think this is part of the dynamic that one has to address.
Okay, thank you. I think the cities you were referring to, I think it's Ceuta and Melilla, I believe.
Ceuta and Melilla, exactly. That's what I
all right, so I believe Mr. Danis has a question.
Yes, please, can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Mr. Triantafylou, thank you very much for a great informative comments. We greatly appreciate it. The questions are both Cyprus, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, the Cyprus issue. The Cyprus issue has been there for 45 years. Turkey, knowing well that it wants to expand into the Eastern Mediterranean and Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic, would they ever give up Cyprus in any way? Will the big powers, European Union, NATO, US, ever force Turkey? Even they haven't done it in the last 45 years. So the only solution for them, I assume, is the two-state solution. What is your comment there? What do you see?
Yeah, I tried to address this before. I mean, I think it still is leverage on the part of Turkey. The two-state solution would mean less of a say in what happens within the EU, because if it's one or two-state solution and you have a federation or confederation, Turkey will always be an actor, even behind the scenes, influencing this new Cypriot government that would be formed. And so it would mean more of a break with the EU, because it would create a totally different sort of understanding and relationship. And so I am not sure that Turkey is ready to go towards this, even though on the other hand, whether one talks to policymakers or politicians from today's government, it's been in power for 18, 19 years, a Turkish government with its own ideological sort of orientation, or you talk to the more Kemalist secular Turks that have been part of the elites for a long time, yes, they would tell you, the strategic value of Cyprus. We know that. It's more than two aircraft carriers, and there's no way we will ever go. We know that argument, but there's also a realization that they will not be able to get away with that. Or there will be consequences. They might be able to get away with that, but there will be some sort of other consequences. So I think Turkey is much more nuanced, and I think it has a lot of leverage on its position in Cyprus proper, by also not being a constructive actor. And it's not the only one that's not constructive in trying to find a resolution in Cyprus, because it means that it's always in there, somehow directly involved.
Yeah. The other question is the Turkey, Greece, Aegean, Eastern Mediterranean, Aegean. Obviously, the energy. There are two points to the energy. I think it is a present, and for the next 25 years, when the green energy perhaps comes to play in a more strategic and consumption way, will that area of the world will be as vulnerable and as confusing through the energy deposits? And will the EU, US will ever do anything to stop Turkey from harassing Greece?
Well, it would if it's its own. If the U.S. would do it, if it considers this to be in its own interests. I mean, this is the only answer for this. The EU has to be more forceful within the EU in trying to make sure that it has an influence on the policy as designed. It has that responsibility, and it has the right to do so, and it has to tell the EU and its partners, hey, listen, there are things that I can and cannot accept. But something, even before the hydrocarbons, before the hydrocarbons came and became so dominant, and with the different fields that we found, Aphrodite and Zor and whatever, the region was unstable anyway, right? Either because it was the Cold War context or in the post-Cold War world as well. So I don't think these things are going to go away. Hydrocarbons do play a role, and in that sense, Turkey considers it to be important, because Turkey, just like Greece and most of the countries of the region, except for the ones that have found some hydrocarbons, are basically net energy importers. So Turkey's strategy has been a long-standing strategy, which is to be a transit hub, right, linking east to west, north to south, and so on, and that spoils the fact that now there are some finds in Cyprus, off Cyprus, Israel, Egypt. That spoil that notion a little bit, and then that's why it wants to be an actor in that factor. Plus the fact that it needs it. It's a country that, as I said, is growing. Its population will grow by 20 million over the next 10, 20 years, and therefore it does need the energy. And just like we talk about China needing more energy, so does Turkey and every big country. And therefore it's trying to find its resources. So that's why, it has made certain discoveries in the Black Sea, and it's trying to exploit them as soon as possible to be less dependent, say, on Russia and others. And I think in that sense, it's important. But the instability in the region, I think, preceded the oil rush, or the gas rush. And I think the instability will still continue unless the actors, the literal states, and the US and the EU in that sense, do find some sort of modus vivendi acceptable to all. Otherwise, we will continue to be dealing with the continued lack of resolution of the Cyprus issue, or the tensions with Turkey, and because and this is the thing also one should consider. If we assume that Turkey's behavior is not necessarily going to change, it might become more nuanced, right? Less coercive, but Turkey will be a country that is growing with a more powerful economy. So how do I, as a Greek policymaker or as a Cypriot policymaker, deal with that when my demographics are negative, when the limits to my economy are what they are? right? I mean, this is a reality also we have to factor in. We're not necessarily factoring in as Greeks that so much, but we have to factor in it. So what do I do in that sense? Is there a way to find a modus vivendi with Turkey that's acceptable to Turkey and to Greece? And therefore, and that's what I'm saying, the EU is important in terms of influence and to the US. But the reality is that never mind the fact that we are focused right now on, on deterrence, which is necessary, because if you feel secure, then you're more apt to sit down and dialogue because you also talk from a position of strength. But deterrence, how long? This is what be it. We'll be arming ourselves to the teeth forever when there's going to be a greater imbalance between the two countries. I mean, we have to deal with that reality. We're not producing any babies. And as I said, our country are small and getting smaller. So, yeah.
We have to live with it.
Well, we can always try to find solutions to it, but I'm just saying we have to keep that in mind as well. And while the Turks are talking about the projections that I said, population and the different economic models that show them, even if tomorrow they call in the IMF or whatever, they'll get over it. The economy will still grow over time. No one in Greece talks about these things for the future of Greece, which is also troubling. Let's sit down and say, what does this mean? What is our population going to be in 10, 20 years, right? And what does this mean on our economy? And so we need to factor that in as well, right? And maybe it will make us think outside the box to something that we have not thought about without undermining national interests and sovereignty and everything else.
So our solution is perhaps to go north in the Balkans and work with the Balkan countries and expand our geographical area.
Well, this is something that Greece started in the 1990s. I remember it was 95, 96, where it was a page 2 article in the Financial Times. The Dimitris government at the time had announced a 500 million euro plan to Greece over 10 years would invest in the Balkans because what happened? I mean, we're not able to take care of our own country and build viable institutions and so on, right? And that was the idea. The idea was that exactly what you said, because the Balkans too, in the grand scheme of things, if you add up the countries of the Balkans, they're really small, right? In terms of population potential. So, but yeah, this is something we need to look at.
Okay, so
Yes.
thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are just right on time.
Okay.
Again, I would like to thank Mr. Danis for his wonderful question, and we're very grateful to have Dr. Dimitris Triantafylou. I really liked your presentation. I'm sure people in the audience do as well. And I would also like to thank Dr. Arvanitopoulos for helping me host this event. Again, we're very grateful to have you all. And just before I end the meeting, I would like to remind everybody that we do have a presentation later today. It's going to be at 11 EDT and then 18 EET. We will have presenters speak on the topic regarding the PRESPA agreement and the significance for the Western Balkans. So I hope to see everybody there. And again, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. And thank you to the guest speaker and our facilitator.
Dimitri, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was an honor. It was my pleasure. And I hope to be able to see you in person soon at some stage.
Yes,
Thank you for the questions and everything. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.